Most people think Operation Market Garden failed because the Germans were stronger than expected, or because the weather turned, or because one bridge, the famous one at Arnhem, was simply a bridge too far. It wasn't. The distance was never the problem. The problem was smaller than that and far stranger. Somewhere in the planning rooms of southern England, in the late summer of 1944, a piece of equipment was approved for a battle it had never been tested for. Nobody checked. And because nobody checked, men who reached their objective on time, who did exactly what was asked of them, sat in a town called Arnhem, unable to tell anyone they'd gotten there at all. I'll come back to that. It matters more than it sounds like right now. I'm Arthur Finch, September 1944. The Allies had broken out of Normandy faster than almost anyone had dared hope. Paris was free. The German army in the west was in retreat, in places close to rout. And in that atmosphere, heady, almost intoxicated with momentum, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed something audacious. A single, concentrated airborne and ground thrust through the Netherlands, seizing a chain of bridges over the great rivers, the Maas, the Waal, and finally the Rhine itself at a town called Arnhem. And from there, a clear road into the industrial heart of Germany. End the war, Montgomery believed, by Christmas. It was bold. It was also, in several specific and avoidable ways, badly built. And to understand how, you have to understand what the plan actually demanded of the men who carried it out. The operation had two halves. Market was the airborne component, 3 divisions, American and British and Polish, dropped from the sky to seize the bridges before the Germans could destroy them. Garden was the ground component, 4 Corps, a British armoured column, racing up a single road 64 miles long to relieve the paratroopers before German pressure overwhelmed them. One road, through low, flat, waterlogged ground where armour couldn't easily move off the verges. The British called it, without much affection, Hell's Highway. 3 bridges had to be taken and held in sequence, at Eindhoven, at Nijmegen, and at Arnhem, by men who would arrive with no armour, no heavy artillery, and only what they could carry or what gliders could bring in alongside them. And of the 3, Arnhem was the one furthest from help, the one that had to hold out longest, and, as it turned out, the one defended by an enemy nobody had quite reckoned with. Stop for a second, because before we go to Arnhem itself, you need to know who was actually raiding there. Allied intelligence believed the area around Arnhem held scattered, low-quality German units, garrison troops, the remnants of formations chewed up in Normandy, hardly worth the term frontline. In fact, by sheer accident of timing, 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, were refitting in the woods just northeast of the town. Battered, under strength, but full of veteran officers and experienced non-commissioned men, the kind who don't panic when paratroopers start dropping out of the sky. There was intelligence pointing to this. Dutch resistance reports, aerial photographs that an officer named Major Brian Urquhart looked at and found troubling enough to raise the alarm, and was, by most accounts, quietly removed from his post for raising it too forcefully right before the operation began. That's worth sitting with. Not because it proves a cover-up. Historians still debate how seriously to weigh that single account, but because it shows you the climate. This was a plan moving under its own momentum, and inconvenient evidence was not especially welcome. You'd assume a force about to drop into contested territory would want every possible warning. You'd be wrong. Or at least, the warnings that existed didn't change the plan. On the morning of September the 17th, 1944, the operation began. It was, visually, one of the most extraordinary spectacles of the entire war. Over 1,400 transport aircraft and well over 300 gliders, stretching across nearly 100 miles of sky. Dutch civilians who watched it pass over still describe it, decades later, as something between violent and beautiful. The sky simply full, wingtip to wingtip, for what felt like an hour. The British 1st Airborne Division under Major General Roy Urquhart dropped onto fields some 8 miles from the Arnhem Road Bridge, too far as it turned out. Chosen that way because the ground closer in was judged unsuitable for gliders, and because planners worried about flak near the bridge itself. 8 miles doesn't sound like much. On a map, in a briefing room, 8 miles is nothing. On foot in September, carrying full kit, opposed every step of the way by men who knew the ground, 8 miles became the difference between a battle plan and a slow-motion disaster. This is the part that matters. Listen to this. One battalion did manage to fight its way to the bridge, the 2nd Parachute Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost. They reached the northern end of the Arnhem Road Bridge on the evening of the 17th, the very first day, exactly as the plan demanded. Around 600 men dug into the houses and warehouses around the bridge approach. They had done their job. They held the objective. By any reasonable measure of what the plan asked of them, they had succeeded. And then they waited for the rest of the division and for the relief column from the south, and almost nothing came. I want you to sit with John Frost's men for a moment, because their story is the human center of everything that follows. These were soldiers who believed, reasonably, that reinforcement was a matter of a day, maybe 2. Instead, they held that bridgehead for 4 days, cut off, increasingly outnumbered, in a battle that became house to house, room to room, fought among burning buildings, with German tanks firing point blank into positions that had no real anti-tank weapons left to answer with. Frost himself was wounded on the 3rd day. By the time the survivors were finally overwhelmed, fewer than half of the men who'd reached that bridge were still able to fight. The rest were dead, or wounded and captured, or, in small, scattered groups, trying to slip back through German lines toward the river. Keep that in mind. Because the question that should be forming in your mind right now is the obvious one. Where was everyone else? This is where we have to talk about the part of this story that doesn't get the attention the fighting does. Because it isn't dramatic in the way a firefight is dramatic. It's a piece of equipment. Specifically, it's a radio set. The British Airborne Forces went into Arnhem relying heavily on a set called the Type 22 Wireless, a man-portable radio meant to give forward units contact with division headquarters and, critically, with the units fighting elsewhere in the same battle. On paper, its range was adequate for the distances involved. In the actual terrain around Arnhem, flat but dense with buildings, trees, and crucially, with the kind of electrical interference and signal absorption that comes from operating inside a built-up town rather than open country, the Type 22 sets performed far below their rated range. Some accounts from signalers on the ground describe getting only a fraction of the expected distance, sometimes barely able to raise a station a few hundred yards away, let alone division headquarters several miles distant. Wait, this is worth being precise about, because it's easy to overstate, and I don't want to. The radios weren't faulty, in the sense of being broken equipment. They performed roughly as similar sets had in other campaigns, in open country over moderate distances, without the specific combination of urban density and the rolling wooded terrain north of Arnhem. What seems to have happened, and this is something signals historians and veterans of the Royal Corps of Signals have written about with real frustration in post-war accounts, is that nobody conducted a realistic test of these specific radios with these specific units over this specific kind of ground before the operation launched. The plan assumed communications would work approximately as they had before. Nobody asked whether before looked anything like Arnhem. Think about that. An operation built on speed, built on the idea that scattered units could be coordinated and reinforced and redirected as the battle developed, depended entirely on a communications plan that had not been proven to function in the environment it was about to be used in. The consequences cascaded almost immediately. General Urquhart himself, the division commander, lost contact with most of his own brigades within hours of landing, and at one point was reduced to moving on foot between units, effectively functioning as his own runner, because there was no other reliable way to know what was happening across his own battlefield. Units that had landed only a few miles apart sometimes had no idea what the others were doing. Requests for reinforcement, for artillery support, for simple information about where the Germans were concentrating, all of it moved, when it moved at all, at the speed of a man on a bicycle or on foot, slipping between German positions, rather than at the speed of a radio call. And meanwhile, 64 miles to the south, Pextex Corps, the ground relief force, was fighting its own battle along Hell's Highway, delayed at Nijmegen by fierce resistance at that bridge, delayed by the single-road bottleneck, delayed by blown culverts and ambushes along a road with no room to maneuver around trouble. They were behind schedule, and because the radios at Arnhem could barely communicate within the town, let alone across 64 miles, the men holding the bridge had almost no real-time sense of how close or how far help actually was. They held on, in part, simply because retreating wasn't really an option, and because surrender wasn't something men like Frost's paratroopers considered while they could still fight. Consider what was happening at Nijmegen at almost the same hour. American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne, alongside British tanks of the Grenadier Guards, fought their way toward the Val Bridge through the 19th and 20th of September, eventually crossing the river itself in flimsy assault boats under direct machine gun fire to take the bridge from both ends at once, an attack that succeeded against heavy odds, largely through sheer nerve. Survivors of that crossing described the water around them churned white by gunfire, boats with no engines, men paddling with rifle butts because the proper oars had been lost or never arrived. They took the bridge, and then, having taken it, the tanks that crossed it paused for the better part of a day by most accounts, before pushing on toward Arnhem, a delay that historians still debate the reasons for, whether caution, exhaustion, or simply the accumulated friction of a plan running behind its own clock. Whatever the cause, that pause cost hours the men at Arnhem didn't have to spare, and by the time armored units began moving again toward the final stretch of road, the window for relieving Frost's bridgehead while it was still intact had narrowed to almost nothing. A young Grenadier Guards officer who took part in that advance wrote afterward of the strange, sick feeling of being so close. Close enough in clear weather to see the smoke rising from Arnhem itself in the distance, while still separated from it by miles of contested road and a river crossing yet to force. That image has stayed with historians for a reason. It captures, better than any casualty figure, what made this operation different from a simple defeat. The Allies weren't beaten back from Arnhem in the way an army is beaten back from a fortress. They were, in a sense, present at the edges of their own objective, watching it burn, unable to close the last few miles in time, and largely unable to even confirm, hour by hour, exactly how urgent that final push truly was. Because the bridgehead they were racing toward could barely tell anyone how close to collapse it had become. I'll say it again, because it's the hinge the entire battle turns on. The plan needed coordination across a scattered, fast-moving battlefield, and the equipment meant to provide that coordination had never been proven to work in the conditions it was sent into. That's not a story about German strength, or even really about Montgomery's ambition being wrong in principle. It's a story about a single, unexamined assumption, made in a planning room weeks before, surfacing on a battlefield in the worst possible way. By the 21st of September, 4 days after the drop, the situation around the bridge had become hopeless in any narrow military sense. Frost's men, out of ammunition, out of water in many positions, fighting from cellars with the buildings above them collapsing under tank fire, finally lost the bridge they had held since the first evening. The rest of the division, several miles to the west around the village of Oosterbeek, formed a shrinking defensive pocket, what survivors simply called the Cauldron, and fought on for several more days, increasingly compressed, increasingly low on everything a unit needs to keep fighting. On the night of the 25th into the 26th of September, What remained of the 1st Airborne Division was evacuated back across the Rhine under cover of darkness, in small boats, under fire, in a scene that, for the men who lived through it, many later described as more harrowing than the fighting itself, precisely because it meant accepting that it was over. Of roughly 10,000 men who had dropped into the Arnhem area 9 days earlier, fewer than 2,300 made it back across the river. The rest were dead, wounded, or in German captivity. By some estimates, total Allied casualties across the entire operation, Arnhem and the corridors south of it together, approached 17,000. The bridge itself, the one objective the whole operation hinged on, was never held long enough to matter, and the war did not end by Christmas.
This is the part that matters most, so I want to say it plainly. There is a version of this story, the popular version, the one that gave the operation its enduring nickname, a bridge too far, that treats the failure as essentially geographic. Too much distance, too much ambition. One bridge beyond what was achievable. And there's truth in that. The plan asked a great deal of men and machines moving through difficult country on a tight schedule. But the geography didn't break the plan by itself. What broke it was smaller, and in some ways more uncomfortable to sit with. Because it wasn't really anyone's villainy, it was an absence. Nobody had asked a simple, almost mundane question before the operation launched. Will these radios actually work? In this terrain? Between these specific units? At these specific ranges? It's the kind of question that sounds almost too basic to be the hinge of a historical disaster. But it was. Because the moment radio communication failed, the entire premise of the operation, speed, coordination, the ability to reinforce success and abandon failure as the picture became clear, collapsed with it. Men who had done exactly what was asked of them, who had reached their bridge on schedule and held it with everything they had, were effectively fighting in the dark, unable to tell anyone, including their own division commander a few miles away, that they were still there, still holding, still waiting for help that had no reliable way of knowing where or how badly it was needed. That's the detail I asked you to keep in mind at the start. Not a German trap, not bad luck with the weather, though the weather did delay reinforcements on several critical days. A radio set, approved for a battle it was never properly tested for, carried into a town where it functioned at a fraction of its intended range, and an entire operations command structure built on the unexamined assumption that it would simply work. I think about John Frost's men sometimes. About what it must have been like to do your job exactly as ordered, to reach the objective, to hold it under fire for 4 days against tanks, with nothing but small arms and stubbornness. And to do all of that without ever really knowing whether anyone beyond your own building's walls understood that you were still there. There's a particular kind of courage in that, not the courage of a single dramatic moment, but the slower, grinding courage of holding a position when you genuinely don't know if it still matters to anyone but you. Montgomery's plan was not reckless in its ambition. Ending the war in 1944 was not a fantasy. It was close enough to plausible that men were willing to risk everything for it. But ambition built on an untested assumption is its own kind of fragility, one that doesn't announce itself in a briefing room. It only announces itself afterward, in the silence of a radio that should have been working and wasn't. I'm Arthur Finch. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you'd like to keep talking about moments like this one, the small failures behind the large ones, there's a link to our community in the description below. I'd be glad to have you there.